Talking ACC football with Mike McDaniel from Inside the ACC. Please join him there for the best in ACC sports coverage with the emphasis on football, of course, and also his podcast. Just jump on Inside the ACC, and you'll find his podcast there with Joey Weaver, another friend and colleague of MarkRogersTV, as we have knocked around the ACC for a number of years here and have a great time talking college football. So the ACC, of course, performed remarkably better than any conference in college football in the postseason last year. It was not debatable. You could argue that the Big Ten had the best regular season. The SEC has the best talent and has had the best run for about 10 years. But for the last 2 or 3 years, it's been a great debate over best conference in college football. Mike, I think the results over the first few weeks weren't the best for the ACC. Some of those even matchups, some of those competitive matchups based on seeding with some of the other conferences didn't turn out well, with North Carolina State losing against South Carolina. Georgia Tech, Tennessee didn't turn out well in overtime. North Carolina losing to a bad Cal team, or what we thought was going to be a bad Cal team at home at that point. Of course, Florida State with the Titanic matchup against Bama was outclassed. Some of the efforts weren't the best for the ACC, but week 3 looked good. Didn't win any huge out-of-conference games, but held serve against teams that they should beat, and that's something that we see across college football that not every conference is able to do across the board. There's usually 1 or 2 letdowns, and the ACC didn't let that happen. So right now, your thoughts about the state of the conference against the Power 5?
They look a lot better than they did after week 1, that's for sure. I think Clemson specifically beating Auburn in week 2, looking as good as they did last night on the road at Louisville. You know, this conference is top heavy, Mark. It is. I think a lot of the, so-called bottom feeder teams in the ACC performed better than a lot of people expected last year. And then, it was such a successful bowl season against out-of-conference teams. And then, you saw Clemson win the national championship. So there were a lot of positives to take away from the ACC last year, especially after bowl season, to really put them ahead of the SEC, at least for last season. The SEC right now looks like a conference that's also very top heavy. You have Alabama. Georgia looks pretty good out of the East. Florida's a really uneven team. They beat Tennessee on a Hail Mary yesterday at home, but I'm still trying to figure out what kind of team Florida is, especially offensively. It's tough to really gauge where the ACC is at right now in comparison to the other conferences through 3 weeks, but I think the one thing's for certain, it's that the top part of the ACC, the top 3 or 4 teams, are as good as advertised. I think we'll know more in the coming weeks once Miami and Florida State play more games. We've really only seen 1 game each for the 2 teams so far through 3 weeks because of the Hurricanes. So, I think now that the weather is getting a little bit better and, that those areas are becoming more habitable, I think that we're going to be able to see what kind of teams, what kind of team Miami has, what kind of team Florida State has without DeAndre Francois. We know they have a great defense, but how's the offense going to look? I think a lot of these questions are going to be answered in the coming weeks. So it's kind of an incomplete gauge of the ACC right now, just because a lot of the teams that we want to see perform well, a Miami team, a Florida State team, we really haven't seen outside of week 1. Miami beat Bethune-Cookman. Florida State obviously lost to Alabama, but they did a lot of good things in that game. Virginia Tech has looked pretty good. I mean, they beat West Virginia on the road out of the Coastal Division, right? So they go out of conference in week 1. They beat West Virginia. They look okay against Delaware. They got off to a slow start against East Carolina, beat them. So there's a lot of good to come out of the conference. Another team is Wake. I'm bouncing around a little bit, but like Wake Forest in the Atlantic, they're 3-0. They've looked really good. NC State might not have gotten off to the start a lot of people wanted to see them get off to, but they are 2-1. They lost a tough game against South Carolina. South Carolina lost to Kentucky yesterday, so that loss doesn't look all that good right now. But that Kentucky team's up and coming, so who knows what the ceiling of South Carolina is this year. Maybe that loss doesn't look as bad at season's end for NC State. But, I think overall there are a lot of teams that we just haven't seen enough of yet to really get a gauge on. And I think once we get into conference play, we'll have a better idea. I want to see Duke's defense go up against a really good offense. I want to see Wake Forest get into conference play against better teams and see how they perform, because they really haven't played anybody yet. They hammered BC in week 2, but they haven't really played anybody yet. So I want to see Wake Forest perform. Duke's defense, want to see what they got. I want to see what kind of team Miami has top to bottom. Wasn't overly impressed with that week 1 performance against Bethune-Cookman. They got off to a slow start. It's week 1. We'll give them a pass. They end up blowing them out of the stadium in the second half, which is what you're supposed to do. Florida State, what kind of quarterback is James Blackman going to be? That's a huge question. So there are a lot of questions right now that are unanswered still that I think we're really going to get a better gauge on here in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But I think the one thing is really apparent. It's that Clemson, I think, is the favorite right now, especially with that DeAndre Francois injury there at Florida State. Clemson is the favorite to win this conference until I see otherwise. Offensively and defensively, they're most complete team in the conference and in the country. But it's just a matter of seeing how the rest of the teams stack up around them to really determine what kind of conference this is going to be this year.
So to your point, Mike, once we get into conference play, there are no FCS opponents or lower tier group of 5 opponents, and there's level competition across the board to a certain extent, and it's easier to evaluate performance, but everybody's playing in their silo. So it's more difficult for me to rate the conferences once they dive into conference play, because if you just look at the results on the field and the results in the standings, every conference goes 500. So you can build a narrative out of whatever you'd like to. So if a conference is dominated by 1 or 2 teams, then you can say either that the conference is weak and those 2 teams dominate the rest of the conference, or you can say that those 2 teams are elite and the conference really isn't that bad. It's just that those 2 teams are very good. Or you could go the other route in which you have a deep conference and there's a lot of beating up of each other, cannibalizing of each other, and you can build the narrative that it's a great conference because anybody can win in any particular week and there's just a lot of really good teams. Or you can build the narrative that it's a marginal conference and nobody's really that good and can compete nationally. So these non-conference games help me build the narrative and help me try to rate these conferences. And I haven't had such a difficult time rating conferences than I have this season because, as I mentioned off the top, the SEC, I think, was legitimately dominant for 7 or 8 years, not as much as the groupthink national media would propose. I think the other conferences were closer, so it becomes a narrative, and then it drives the discussion to one end of the spectrum, and I think the SEC capitalized on that. And if you really dig into the results, they weren't as dominant the conference was against the Power 5 as was publicized, but it was the best conference, and there was really no debating that until about 2014, and now it's been up for debate, and the ACC played the best in the big games with the seedings leveled in postseason play last year. Now with the results of the ACC in week 1, the Big Ten playing well for the most part in week 1, but then some other teams jumping in there like Oklahoma taking out Ohio State impressively, and Oklahoma State looking like a really strong team, although we don't have a like matchup for them to be compared. This is the most parity I can remember in college football amongst the 5 conferences. I would rate them without running the numbers, and when I do run the numbers in the next couple of days and come out with my conference rankings, I'll take into consideration, okay, what's the overall record of the conference against all competition, because they have yet to play any conference games. So I don't include the conference games. So Clemson-Louisville is not a game for the ACC and a game against the ACC. I just throw it out because it's a 500 record for the conference. But how well did the conference perform out of conference, number 1? Number 2, against the Power 5, and I think that's more significant. How did they perform against the Power 5? But you also have to take into consideration seedings, because not all the seedings are fair. Tennessee, Georgia Tech's a good game. North Carolina State, South Carolina is a good matchup because they're like-seeded teams in each conference. But when Oklahoma State blows out Pitt, yes, they did what they had to do. They looked impressive. Maybe they're a little bit better than we thought they were, and maybe Pitt's not quite as good. So it's a slight knock against the ACC, but I don't take that too much into consideration because we're talking about clearly one of the 2 best teams in the Big 12 playing the 9th or 10th best team in the ACC. So that should happen. And then, obviously, yes, taking those seedings into comparison. So I've yet to run the numbers, but my feel for it right now is that the SEC is the best conference because they have no bad teams, no really, really awful teams. There are no Illinois, there are no BCs or Syracuses, there are no Kansases or Baylors in the SEC, we take a team like Vanderbilt playing Kansas State, who was ranked, and they beat them last night at home. And Kansas State's probably going to turn out to be, again, the third, fourth, or fifth best team in the Big 12, something in that range, and Vanderbilt wins that game. So I think the ACC is the second best conference. I think the SEC is just so deep. And the only issue with the SEC right now, unless Georgia steps up or maybe Auburn, is that there's really not a clear 2 or 3. So the SEC used to flood the top 10. Half the top 10 used to be the SEC for 7 or 8 years. 5 of the top 10 teams in the country were SEC teams, and it was legitimate. Now there's Alabama, and there's a bunch of like top 25 teams, but they're like 20th. They're like maybe 15th. And there's this gap, and there's no really legitimate top 5 to 10 teams in the SEC unless, again, it becomes Georgia or Auburn. So there is a gap there, but the conference is just so deep and has really no awful teams. So that's why I give the SEC the edge top to bottom over the ACC. The Big Ten I would put number 3, the Big 12 at number 4, and the Pac-12 at number 5. Won't go through those explanations right now, but I think it's extremely close.